Hello, welcome to the program. Hope all's going well. This is Strategy with Dr. M. Stolard. And, people say that, you should just use your first name. But the truth is I earned that degree, I earned that degree. I ended up writing a dissertation, entitled Business Intelligence, the Influence of Sentiment Analysis on Small Businesses. And so sentiment analysis, for those who don't know, is the act of identifying and evaluating authentic human thought, opinions, that are expressed, whether it's about a business, about a product or organization, or as a company as a whole, right? So it's a bunch of words, bunch of fancy words, but basically how does the customer feel about that particular product or service, right? And you see it a lot when people post things on social media, people make videos about certain things, their thoughts, how they feel about it. Did they purchase it? Would they use it again? Did they actually get what they wanted out of it? Right. So anyway, my intention, and let's get into this topic today. So the intention is to create a playbook, right? I think I mentioned this before, that focuses on brand strategy in the midst of a brand crisis, right? So the playbook, although anyone can read it, would really be geared for, those who are truly entrepreneurial. It will be written and designed for, community organizations, those that want to create social impact, with any research, you have a specific question to help kind of guide that particular research that places parameters around the problem you're attempting to solve or attempting to research and maybe even solve. So two things that I'm hoping to focus on is two main questions. My thoughts are that brand strategy can be used to help build trust, maintain reputation during a brand crisis in a community organization. And then another component of that is, what are the best practices for a community organization to develop and implement an effective brand strategy while in the midst of a crisis? This essentially is the question or the area of focus that's going to be guiding, quote unquote, creating this playbook. Even though I've talked about it already, it's something that's going to be, forever evolving. So if you haven't checked out my first couple episodes, to kind of see my thoughts on that, then you would kind of get those. So essentially, I want to use crisis management strategies to assist community organizations and those individuals who are creating social impact and somehow, mitigate reputational damage to their brand. So the problem is when crisis hits, when budgets have to be cut, marketing is usually what's kicked to the side, right? Marketing is usually the first thing that says, we need to reduce, we need to get rid of, and so forth. And so I want to look at crisis management strategies and leadership and those who I've mentioned before. Dr. Erica James over at Wharton, Dr. Dutch Leonard over at Howard Business School. And I mentioned Judy Smith before. And so today we're going to discuss Miss Judy Smith's book, Good Self, Bad Self. However, when I read it, it's a little interesting that it was entitled Good Self, Bad Self, Transforming Your Worst Qualities into Your Biggest Assets, right? But when I got the book, when I physically got the physical copy, it was actually rebranded, right? So kind of interesting. So we rebranded to Good Self, Bad Self, How to Bounce Back from a Personal Crisis. And so this is actually the book here. This is actually what it looks like, at least the version that I got. No, she's not here. I have not reached out to her for an interview, but I just kind of wanted to take a look at it and maybe talk about it just for a little bit, but look and see if there is some way we can apply brand strategy based on some of the things that she's talking about. So, but just look, I did reach out to her to confirm if it was the exact same book though, right? Or was this like version 2.0 or something like that? And again, it's not going to be a book report, but let me do say that, yes, the book is good. You should definitely read it. You can get it from Amazon or any place books are sold, right? So Let me tell you about the book first. So again, I'm not here to give any spoilers or a lot of spoilers, but I definitely suggest, yes, that you read it. But for clarity, again, I said before, the book has 2 titles, right? Good Self, Bad Self, Transforming Your Worst Qualities into the Biggest Assets. But now the book has been rebranded. It even looks different. The original book was yellow. But now the book's the picture that I showed you. And it says, Good Self, Bad Self, How to Bounce Back from a Personal Crisis. So far, looking at the book, this is the physical copy, it is essentially the same book. I haven't seen that much different in it. And so maybe if someone will let me know, then that would be great. But that's it. So the book was written by crisis management expert, Miss Judy Smith. And if you've seen the TV show Scandal, it was a show that was on several years ago. She is the muse or the inspiration for that particular show. And so it draws on her own experience and real life case studies to explore the connection between personal and professional crisis management, right? So this book explores that. And one of the things it talks about is the reason crises take place is pretty much our own fault, right? That's my takeaway. It's pretty much our own fault, right? We have not taken control over our actions, or what she refers to as our traits, proactively. Okay. So again, the book explores the reason the crises take place. It's pretty much our fault, right? We're not taking control over our actions proactively in a proactive manner. And she indicates that it's, not to end up on these juicy scandals, right? The way not to end up on these juicy scandals, the way not to end up on these juicy scandals that we see on TV, these hellacious stories that kind of come out, is you need to be paying attention to yourself and then the people who work around you. And I'm not going to go through all of her case studies, but there was one scenario where I think the gentleman was like, I can't believe this happened. I don't know how this has happened, and the person was a CEO, but the situation was actually based on one of his subordinates who was also very high up in the company, right? But one of the things she mentioned is you got to be paying attention. You can't overlook stuff, right? You need to be able to balance the key traits that cause crises to take place. I'm not going to give you all of them, but sometimes she referenced that ego. Ego is a reason, right? Or denial. Sometimes, and sometimes it's the lack of patience. Sometimes it's denial of what's usually obvious right in front of us, and the lack of patience, right? And there's several others, right? Again, I don't want to give out the whole book, but those are some of the things we're just kind of talking a little about today. All right. So the part I want to focus on most was regarding her framework, right? And so I want to see if we can use it to help build, an effective brand strategy for when a crisis does take place. You need to look through it through that particular eye. So as we have discussed before, in our previous episode, the types of brand crises that we focus on would be like losing money or declining sales, right? And you have to figure out what's going on with that. Why is that happening? Maybe you're getting negative feedback from customers consistently, and that maybe wasn't the norm at one point in time, right? Increased competition, maybe from an unforeseen competitor, or maybe a competitor that's been around, and all of a sudden they just kind of, up their game, and people are starting to like what they see and like what they hear. Inconsistent messaging, and visual identity, an inconsistent visual identity, right? These are some things that are really designated in at least in the marketing space as a crisis. So her framework is the acronym POWER, right? For those who are running community organizations and individuals who are pursuing social impact, I feel like this can be helpful, right? So the first one is P, which is pinpoint a core trait. Pinpoint the core trait. In other words, you want to determine if the reason for the crisis is your ego, or is it someone else's ego? Is it denial? Is it lack of patience? Now, so what happens sometimes is that if it's our fault, you don't always want to admit that it's our fault, right? We always want to say it's someone else's fault. And that in itself is an ego in itself, right? Again, if someone has certain behaviors that are causing certain issues and so forth, then, that's denial. That means seeing the obvious and not necessarily kind of aware of it, right? So maybe in the brand strategy space, if someone doesn't have the skill set that you thought they had, right? They're supposed to be able to do certain things. They promised be able to handle certain things, and they weren't able to do so, such as maybe replying back to clients on a regular basis, right? right? So lack of patience, or any of the other specific traits that are in the book. So that's P. O is to own it, to take back control of what's going on, right? Take back control of what's going on. So me, that looks like when you are trying to assess the situation, right? You're in a crisis, you're aware of the crisis. Now you have to figure out, what? You have to be honest with yourself and say, what? This is really happening, right? We are losing a lot of money, maybe 3 months in a row, for the entire quarter, and we're going to have to make a change. Or the campaign that we released is not being as effective as we thought it was going to be, and we're going to have to make adjustments to that. We're going to have to maybe hire a different agency or different production team, or the creative brief that we put together wasn't really as effective or clear, right? And so we're going to have to make adjustments in that particular round. So the W for her was work it through, right? In other words, to determine how these traits caused the distraction, right? The distraction was maybe it took your eyes off the ball, right? So again, we're talking about just ego, and we're talking about denial, talking about the lack of patience. You have to work it through. You have to really take a look at what's going on and really truly analyze to see what actually caused this. Because what's happening is when you're dealing with for this particular book, what they're looking at is really your personal traits, your personal characteristics. It's not just the technical aspect of it, right? We as sometimes marketers, with our brand strategists, we look at the technical skill level and feel like that's the reason why things are happening. So if you do something more technical, then things will fix itself. But sometimes you need to really look at the personality traits of what's happening. And this is why I think this book gives you a different perspective, right? So again, Ms. Smith explains that E is to explore it, right? This is about how a particular trait may have caused so much grief and so much problem, and then you want to look at to see if this particular issue is going to cause an issue in the future, right? You can't just assume that because this happened once, that it's not going to happen again, right? If your ego is playing an effect, is causing an issue, you have to understand that it's possible this ego can play again unless you get it checked, unless you figure out what's going on, right? Ego can be taking off more than you can chew, right? Taking on a bigger project than your company can handle, and now what you've done is you embarrassed the company, right? That could be exploring it. That could be an issue to look at the future. Denial. You're just denying the fact that, these negative comments don't mean anything. Who are the negative comments coming from, right? You just deny that it's happening. You usually maybe you get 5 to 10 negative comments a day or thumbs down, right? In the Facebook world, and that may not be uncommon, but now you're getting 20 and 30 and 40, and you didn't even take the chance to figure out what's going on. Did somebody post something or say something that was just not true or offensive? You got to be able to look at that. And you have to truly understand is that this is something that's going to happen again in the future, which is why a lot of times when you see people that have certain types of industries, maybe they're anchors on the news station, things of that nature, they let them go in some cases. And I'm not telling you what you have to do for your staff, but sometimes they'll let go because when you take the time to think about it and to explore it, as Ms. Smith would say, then you want to see and understand if this behavior is going to stop, or is this behavior is going to continue. This behavior is so ingrained in it that it's not going to fix itself, right? And so you have to make that decision accordingly, right? Unless it's marketers and so forth, right? You have influence to talk to the CEO, to kind of let them know this is what it looks like from this particular standpoint. Or if you are the CEO, this is what decisions you're going to have to make, right? One of the things to talk about is like who's in charge. It's the first thing you have to determine who's in charge. If it's you or if it's someone else, you have to be able to make sure that if it's not you, then you need to be in communication with that particular person, especially if you're the one that's over marketing. Because again, marketing always gets looked to the side, right? And it's a bigger hill to climb up, dig yourself out of if you're not doing anything with the marketing at all, just kind of letting it be in the middle of a brand crisis. Okay. The last piece is R, right? That's the last part of the framework, R, as in to rein it in. That means to take back control, right? So this comes down to maybe the third step that I mentioned in my brand crisis playbook, which is to identify the problem, right? However, the book encourages you to take a look a lot deeper, right? But for me, What I mentioned was the first question you need to ask is, um, is everyone okay? And it's a question I indicated that you don't want to take it for granted. You don't know how your team is going to react. It's possible these traits that we mentioned earlier, ego, denial, lack of patience, right, are part of the reason that the brand crisis has even presented itself, right? So when you ask if everyone is okay, when you determine if everyone's okay, you want to really understand if the responses that you're getting are truthful, especially if people are saying, yeah, I'm fine. And when you're asking these questions to your staff and your stakeholders and those people who you're talking with, it's okay if it's a little chaotic initially when you're having that conversation, right? People just kind of getting it out, the systems, then in order to make an effective strategic decision, right, you have to figure out what happened, in other words, you have to be able to rein it in, take back control, right? This means you have to look into the mindset of yourself as well as your staff. So now, if your personality, if it's your personality, someone else's on your team's personality has led to a crack in the armor that that has put your organization in a place where this brand crisis is now here and present, you have to determine how to balance control with what's going on. You need to take back control of your mindset, take back control of the mindset of the person who may have caused this. And it's okay to realize that sometimes it's, in the world of marketing and brand strategy, the reason why you're in the middle of a brand crisis may have went down back to a particular person, or a series of person. But if it's also behaviors, that also needs to be looked at, and where did this behavior start? Did it start with you? People just implementing the things that you're implementing, saying the things that you're saying. Maybe they overheard you talking crazy about a customer or client, and you didn't think anyone was listening to you, that they started to say the same thing. Right? Not knowing who you were talking to. This can create a horrible situation. You need to take back control of your mindset and the mindset of people who are working for you. And if you do not, you could end up in a horrible situation once again. That's what we talked about earlier, right? Is the traits that are causing this issue something that's going to revisit itself, it's going to present itself again, So you can look at this book and the concept of this book as a way to be proactive and preventative. The traits that make you so successful also can create challenges that make life sometimes, and even your business difficult, your organization difficult. The things you're trying to accomplish make it more challenging. One of the key themes of this book, and I said this earlier, is the importance of being self-aware, right, and self-reflecting. You have to be able to look at yourself and figure out what's going on. Ms. Smith states that individuals must be honest with themselves about what are their strengths and their weaknesses, and they must be actively working to improve and manage both, right? Sometimes these traits that we're talking about are strengths. Your ego is taking you so far, but it's also sometimes your weakness as well, right? And she provides exercises and strategies for the readers when you read these things to help develop self-awareness, and cultivate their good self, as she may say, right? And then techniques for kind of managing the bad self as well, especially during times of very intense and stressful brand crisis situations. Another important part of this book is the importance of communication, right? And as long as you hear me on this series, we will be talking about communication in a brand crisis management. Ms. Smith emphasizes the need for honesty, for transparency, for empathy, right? Empathy with your clients and customers and really understanding how they've been affected. And if you're the leader, then you have to make sure you're empathizing with your teammates and the people who report to you, right? And communicating with stakeholders during a crisis, with volunteers, if that's what's going on, with the people who you're serving, you want to be able to provide guidance. You're going to have to help lead how to craft particular messages that acknowledge the situation, but also indicating and communicating that it's being looked at, it's being looked after, that you're not just letting things slide. So That's what I'll have for you today. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Again, if I was going to show this book, I have to do it like this, right? But Good Self, Bad Self, How to Bounce Back from a Personal Crisis with Miss Judy Smith, the real life crisis expert who inspired ABC Scandal, right? So if you can like and subscribe, that would be wonderful. You've been listening to Strategy with Dr. M. Stolard. I am Dr. M. Stolard, and remember to keep pushing forward, to drive your influence, and be intentional by using strategy. All right? We'll see you next time.